I do believe we are at a major transition point in the history of the United States and probably of the whole world. I know that sounds grandiose, and I don't normally talk in grandiose terms, but the situation calls for it. For most of the last 50 years, roughly since 1970, the dominant economic reality of the global economy and of the United States as the major player and shaper of that global economy in the last 50 years, that period can be characterized by many names, but the one that economists use is the phrase neoliberal globalization. And here's what it means, that in an era that we remember with names like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, we turned away from the legacy of the New Deal. We turned away, as did many other countries, from the notion that a catastrophe like the Great Depression of the 1930s required that government play a major role in keeping capitalism tolerable for the mass of people. Remember what we did in the 1930s. We established Social Security that had never existed before in the United States. We established a minimum wage. We established unemployment insurance, and the government hired and paid 15 million people who were unemployed, and nothing like that had ever happened in the United States either. The government was called in to do all these things, in the words of one clever thinker, to give capitalism a human face. And it was paid for because it was very expensive, as you can imagine. To give every elderly American a Social Security check every month for the rest of their lives. To give unemployed people a check every week for a year or two. To hire 15 million people. And the money that paid for all of that were heavy taxes placed on corporations and the rich. The politician who had the courage to tax corporations and the rich, Franklin Roosevelt, was re-elected president 3 consecutive times. He has been and is to this moment the most successful popular president in the history of the United States, starting with George Washington. So not only can you tax corporations and the rich, but when we had a president who was forced from below to do it, he became the most popular politician we've ever had. In the period starting in 1970, as the memory of the New Deal, as it was called, faded, Reagan and Thatcher undertook to roll the New Deal back. It had already begun before that, but it really gathered steam. And the mantra was the reverse of the New Deal. Instead of calling the government in to give capitalism a human face, people stumbled over one another, led by the Republicans, but tragically followed by the Democrats, to roll the government back, to get the government out of the economy, to go back to a capitalism which, if I may be allowed to continue the metaphor, lacks a human face. And over the last 50 years, the government not only didn't regulate the way it once did, didn't intervene the way it once did, but it blessed the decision of corporate America to go where the profits were the greatest, which is what capitalism normally does. And where were profits the greatest? Answer: China. Starting in the 1970s, we had a mammoth exodus of American corporate leaders. They had graduated from business school. They were taught, if you want to succeed in business, go to where the wages are low and the market is expanding. The place where the wages were low and the market was expanding the most was in the land called China. And American corporations British and French and German and Italian and Japanese, they all went to China, where they were welcomed, where they were celebrated. And over the last 40 to 50 years, the Chinese economy grew. About half the economy there is capitalist, private companies working pretty much the way they do here. The other half of the Chinese economy is government-owned and operated enterprises working the way they once did in places like the Soviet Union. China is a hybrid between the US and the Soviet Union, different from both because it's a mixed situation. And it turns out that under the leadership of the Chinese Mao Zedong and the ones that have come since him, it turns out this hybrid organization can grow faster than any other economic system the world has ever seen. For the last 30 years, China has grown its economy, its GDP, between 6 and 9% per year. During that time, the United States GDP grew between 2 and 3% a year. It doesn't take rocket science to understand that if you can manage that difference, if China can grow 2 to 3 times faster than the United States for 30 years, it can do what it has now done. Namely, it's caught up. World War II eliminated the potential competitors economically of the United States. Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and Japan, all destroyed by that war. Russia too. Russia never was an economic competitor. It isn't now either. The GDP of the United States right now is about $25 trillion. The GDP of Russia about now is 3, maybe 4 trillion. It's part of why the entire Cold War will have to be revisited so Americans can finally learn what the truth about all of this is. Today, the United States has a competitor economically. We haven't had one for a century. Powerful, highly developed, and able to outcompete the United States across the board, from the lowest to the highest technology which either side is capable of. And the United States has not yet come to terms with this situation. The American people are engaged in what my psychotherapist wife explains to me is called denial. The pretense, mostly to yourself, that the reality around you isn't there. It's best understood when glimpsing a toddler confronted by a scary barking dog, and the toddler puts his or her hands in front of her eyes, comforted by the thought that if you can't see the dog, it isn't there. But we all know you grow up, and at a certain point, not many years later, you come to understand you can put your hand there, but it doesn't make the dog disappear. China's going nowhere. China is growing. Economic growth for the United States, 2024, will be 2.8%, right on target with what it's been on and off for a long time. The economic growth of China this year will be 4.8%, nearly double. And the economic growth of India will be 7%. The next time you hear an American politician or you read in an American newspaper how the American economy is doing better than anyone in the world, please remember the word denial. That kind of statement, which I encounter almost every day, is the exact equivalent of a toddler putting fingers in front of her eyes or nose in hoping that the scary dog will go away. Not only have the Chinese outgrown us, but they have built an alliance with other countries that are recognizing that what was true for the last 75 years, a global economy dominated by the United States as the country that came out of World War II with no bombs that fell on it other than Pearl Harbor, and less damage than any other developed country. The Chinese have built an alliance called the BRICS. You don't hear as much about it as you ought to. It started a few years ago: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. A year and a half ago, 6 more joined. And 3 weeks ago, 13 more joined. The BRICS together is more than half the population of this planet. The United States is 4.5%. The total output of goods and services in the BRICS is significantly larger than the total output of the United States and its major allies, known as the G7. The United States, Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. So now every country in the world, every company in the world is reassessing and redesigning its strategy for the future. And what do I mean? They're redesigning because the dominant player in the world of the last 70 years isn't the dominant player anymore. There is a bigger, richer player in the BRICS, which means if you're going to build a railroad in your country, you don't just go to Washington or London or Paris. You may go to them, but you're going to ask them what offer they can make, and then you're going to compare it to what you can get from Beijing, New Delhi, and Sao Paulo. And in case after case, the choice is made to go with the BRICS, not the West. I mean to tell you all that if you asked me to tell you what is the biggest reality we now have to face, it's the end of the American empire. What we inherited from the British, because they had the last empire before this one, is now over, and there is zero chance it's coming back. It ought to have been a central issue in the presidential election we just had. Instead, the two candidates and their parties worked overtime to practice denial. No such a thing. The war in Ukraine, just to take one of countless examples, will show you how costly this denial is. When the war begins in February of 2022, President Biden told us, along with all of his officials, Russia would be brought to its knees. The Russian currency, the ruble, would collapse. The entire West would side with Ukraine against the Russian invasion and would defeat the Russians. None of that happened. Every part of that prediction proved false. Why? Because the way Russia was to be brought to its knees was by denying the market for Russian oil and gas, whose export the Russians depend on. It's a major industry for them. And they exported all of that energy to Western Europe. When the Western Europeans, under pressure from the United States, closed their markets to Russia, the expectation was that Russia would collapse. Instead, Russia went to its allies in the BRICS, above all China and India, and arranged to sell to them the oil and gas they no longer sold to the Europeans. As a result, Russia is growing faster this year than the United States throughout the war. You couldn't be more mistaken than this. That's what it means if you deny a reality. All right, let me tell you the next step of this because it drives home the point. What we know about the history of every other empire that also grew, was powerful, and then died was that the ride up as you're growing is a lot more fun and pleasant than the ride down when you're dying. The ride up was the 20th century. which many of you, like me, lived through. We now have to figure out how we descend when our empire is dying. You can travel to Britain today and encounter no small number of people who still imagine that the British Empire is still there. Witness the inauguration ceremonies for King Charles, who's the king of nobody. What is this? Here's how it works in the United States. People who are rich and powerful are offloading the costs of a declining empire off of themselves. They don't want to suffer, which I understand. But if the economy is going down, which it is, and the people at the top are keeping theirs, which they are, then the rest of us, the middle class, the lower classes, the poor, we're going to be taking it on the chin more and more.